It's hard to make predictions right now because we have had this seismic shift with our major trading partner south of the border. It really does depend if there are tariff barriers erected around the US and which side of those tariff barriers we're going to be on. Are we going to be inside the wall or are we going to be outside the wall?
This is the Saskatchewan Real Estate Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Saskatchewan Real Estate Podcast, your home for all things Saskatchewan, all things real estate. I am really excited about today's episode because I love digging into what's happening in the economy, what we've seen, and potentially what we can see forward. And today, do a quick introduction for our esteemed guest helping with this. He's a professor of economics at the University of Regina. He earned his PhD and master's degree at McMaster University and his undergraduate degree at Mount Allison University. He has published academic papers on a wide range of topics, including international finance and currency crisis. His research has been published in the Journal of Public Economics, Canadian Public Administration, and International Journal of Drug Policy. He is routinely sought out by Canadian and international news media for commentary on economic issues and public finance. Dr. Jason Childs, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me on.
It's a real pleasure always to get someone who lives in this world and to get your take on these things that I think a lot of people walk around at the local coffee shop and have these questions. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. And what I'd like to kind of do is recap 2024 in Saskatchewan and then kind of give us a perspective of potentially what will happen in the future. So let's start it off with 2024, Dr. Childs. What were some of the trends that we saw in the province?
So we saw rising unemployment, unfortunately, but that's part of a national trend. We did see some economic growth, which is really encouraging. We saw population growth, which is pretty good news for us. So we've got a mix of good and bad news with population growth and with overall economic growth really not quite keeping up with that population growth. So we've seen the unemployment rates rise. We've seen wages rise, but not as much as would be needed to keep up with the inflation we've experienced over the last few years. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
How do those different things counteract each other? Because one would think that if the economy is growing, there should be more jobs. Walk us through some of those dynamics and how we can kind of see those counter narratives playing against each other.
So we are seeing more jobs. We are seeing more employment. Employment is up about 1.2% year over year, but we've seen population grow a little faster than that. So we've got people entering the labor force. Either they're aging into it, so you're hitting 15 or whatever, and you're out of school, you're starting to look for a job, you're going to show up that way. And we've got people moving to the province for the first time, not always to start a job immediately on arrival. So both of those things are going to see unemployment rise at the same time that employment itself is rising.
Mm-hmm. Do you, in your research, do any thoughts on different economies that are doing well, that aren't doing well, as far as agriculture, gas, anything like that, Dr. Child?
So sectorally, we can look at different what's going on in the Saskatchewan economy. We're seeing, crop production do moderately well this year in most areas, or overall. Some areas are, yields were a little down. The prices are a little bit soft. We are seeing manufacturing slow down in its growth. It's not manufacturing output hasn't grown as much as it might. Merchandise exports, we're not doing as well as we might there. We are seeing mineral sales do really well. That mining sector, that oil and gas sector is continuing to do reasonably well, and the government sector, the public service sector, continues to grow and be a major player in the Saskatchewan economy.
So packing that first answer and saying what trends are going to kind of carry into 2025. If we look at some of those things, what do you project? Or no one has a perfect crystal ball, but is there a sense of what we're going to see continue?
Right. Well, the crystal ball is definitely in the shop. It's hard to make predictions right now because we have had this seismic shift with our major trading partner south of the border. But it really does depend if there are tariff barriers erected around the US and which side of those tariff barriers we're going to be on. Are we going to be inside the wall or are we going to be outside the wall? If we're inside the wall, I think things are going to look pretty good for us. We're going to face less competition when we try and sell our goods and services into the U.S. market. If we're outside the wall, and we're competing on that same playing field with Mexico and others, I think things are going to get a lot harder for us.
Can you expand upon that for me a little bit, Dr. Childs, meaning the inside the wall and outside the wall? And is that really to do with the proposed tariffs that President Donald Trump is talking about now, where if you're in the US, if something's being brought in and it's from another country, there might be this tariff that's included with that. And so is there a thought that this might be really negative news if you're a producer of some of those things that are being imported into the States?
Absolutely. So let's take a barrel of oil just for as a concrete example. Right now, we'd be getting about, say, let's say $60 a barrel for it because it's West Texas Intermediate minus Western Canada Select is discounted from West Texas Intermediate. So we might be getting about $60 a barrel, $65, whatever. That's fine. That's right now when there are no tariffs on it. Now, if Trump imposes this 10% tariff, anytime somebody imports a barrel of oil from us, instead of $65, they're going to have to pay $71.50. Right? There's another $6.50, 10% that goes on the top of that. So either we're going to have to accept less for our oil than we were before, or they're going to have to pay more. And if they pay more, they're going to be more interested in buying it elsewhere, like American produced oil. So it really does depend on what happens with those tariffs. If we see a return to tariffs, which was one of the campaign promises, and if they are levied against Canada. Right now, we've got some insulation with the U.S., Mexico, Canada free trade agreement. We'll see what happens when that's renegotiated next year as well.
So a lot of these things are kind of let's wait and see. Can we walk us through different thought experiments that, if a tariff were put in place, is not the counter action of that Canadians would then put imports on US products that are coming in? And is the net effect not only that, there might be a tariff that the government will collect tax on, but things will get a little bit more expensive here if there does start to be this tariff war that will take place?
Trade wars lead to higher prices for consumers. It really is that simple. And when prices rise dramatically for consumers, they consume less. So demand falls, we lose access to foreign markets, and domestic consumption falls because we're paying more for everything. That means our production's got to fall as well. And if you want to be, a bit of fear mongering with this, which is always fun and exciting, one of the major reasons for the Great Depression in the 1930s was a trade war. So the U.S. started it off, fired this first salvo with an act called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising tariffs 50% on just about everything from everywhere. Now, Canada, here's a fun little factoid. Canadian government tends to move faster when it wants to than American government. So we did the same thing to them, but we implemented our tariffs first. They started it, but we beat them to the punch. What happened, and this was replicated all around the world, international trade collapsed. And that meant demand for products shrank globally, and we saw a lot less production globally. So I'm hoping we don't repeat that sort of silliness, but it's always a possibility.
The opposite of that. Let's say that we're inside the wall. Donald Trump says Canada's a good friend. We share a massive border with them. There's lots of products that goes back and forth between the two economies. If there is positive relations on the trade side, Saskatchewan being a great exporter of different natural resources, as you mentioned, crops, oil, gas, uranium. If we're on the inside of that wall, what are some projections, or what are maybe a positive side of how this could go?
Well, we've got to be a little careful, because I don't think if we're inside that wall, we might displace some demand for some products. But a lot of the products, the big headline products that we're talking about here, uranium, there's not a lot of competition in that globally. We're one of the few, right? Potash, we're one of 3 countries that really seriously exports potash, and almost all of the Canadian potash comes from right here. So we're going to get a little more access. Where that's going to play out more importantly, that supply chain argument is going to play out more importantly for Saskatchewan, would be things like steel. What happens with the steel plant right here? I think it's Brunswick now. Forgive me, I've lost track of the name changes. And where they're able to sell their steel into the U.S. or not. But in Ontario, Southern Ontario, with the automotive industry, that is going to tell the tale. And if we're on the wrong side of the tariff wall for that, if Canada's on the wrong side of the tariff wall for that industry, there is going to be some major dislocation.
For the products that Saskatchewan specifically sells, you kind of alluded that they are rare and valuable in a lot of cases. Does that help insulate the province economically as far as some of our major economic exports? That the things we sell are those rare and valuable items, and that does help to insulate against some of these different tariffs that might take place, whether it be between the US or other trading partners?
Yeah, a lot of the time you tend to be really careful about putting tariffs on products like potash, just because it's so important for food security and sovereignty. So if you're in a country like China, you might go after canola, as we've seen a couple of times, but you're not going to go after potash, because then your own farmers can't produce and keep up. And that makes it really obvious that you're hitting your own people with higher food prices and less food availability, less food security. So we do have some insulation. If we are going to see a move away from fossil fuel uh, based electrical generation towards nuclear generation, then a reliable supplier like Chemical and Saskatchewan really becomes important. So if we're going to see a fossil fuel generation displaced by nuclear, then that's good news for us. But it's bad news for us too, because we also export oil. So there's a bit of give and take there.
Yeah, and this wasn't on the list of questions that I'd prepped you with, but it's just kind of come to my mind here. The importance of government lobbyists and trade, I guess, diplomats. It sounds like that's going to be more important than ever, especially for a province like Saskatchewan, where we do have so much stuff to export. We're not going to eat all the wheat that we grow, or burn all the gas that we produce, or we don't have the uranium plants. A lot of the stuff, it goes outwards. So is the importance of a great local government that's going to go out there and market these products more important than ever? Or does that fall to the private sector? Just walk me through what that looks like.
Well, it's a little bit of both, right? We need, the private sector is obviously going to be maintaining contacts and lobbying for market access. And unfortunately for Saskatchewan, the current federal government hasn't done a great job in lobbying for market access for Saskatchewan products. So the provincial government has taken that on, and is doing its own lobbying for market access, and going around the world and having these trade missions in different countries saying, hey, we want to sell you our products. Our products are really good. There's a lot of reasons to use Saskatchewan, and we've had some success with that. So having that sort of three phase, ideally, private, provincial, and federal lobbying on behalf of Saskatchewan producers, can pay some real dividends. Again, if everybody's mad at everybody and we have a federal government levying tariffs, it's going to be really politically difficult for those same countries not to levy tariffs on the things that they import from us. So it is sort of a childish tit for tat kind of game, but it does get played, and it does have really important consequences.
So I love the discussion here because I brought you on and say, what are we going to see in 2025? And it does sound like there is a multitude of ways this could go. It's not very lockstep that this is what we saw in 2024. This is what we'll see in 2025. With a lot of changes around the world, it does sound like it's kind of a wait and see heading into the new year.
Well, I mean, there's always the joke about the dictator who wanted a one-armed economist, right? And so he got really sick of, well, on the one hand, but on the other. Right? If you want a straight prediction for the future, don't ask an economist.
Sure.
The answer is always it depends, and it really does depend. And there are more variables in play this year than I've seen in a little while. The last time I was this uncertain about international trade would have been 2007, 2008. Because there was a real sense that the global trade system was going to be under attack as different countries dealt with the fallout from the financial crisis. And, our government, thankfully at the time, did a really good job of lobbying and convincing other governments not to restrict imports as a way of minimizing the blow.
As trade, the velocity of trade slows down, that can kind of lead to these big, broad slowdowns. And so, as long as your trade stays up, on the smaller sense, then economically things can kind of roll along here.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why Saskatchewan really avoided the 2008, 2009 recession. China really ramped up its spending, government spending, and others, and that meant a lot of products flowing out of Saskatchewan towards China. So that big spending boom by China insulated us and other provinces as well from much of the fallout from the financial crisis.
So if we were to give advice to the people in the private and the public sector, it would be find those key trading partners who have big pocketbooks for the things that we are selling. And this is really going to help us no matter what happens, whether it be a thriving economy or things are a little slower, to find a market for these products.
Yeah, and if we can find the market and get access to it, that's going to help us a lot. And different, and we don't need to have all our eggs in one basket. We want to be trading with as many different people as possible. Although I think that's going to get harder in the coming years as major trading partners like the US make demands about who we trade with and how.
Very fascinating. Okay, so the average person is watching this, and we're going to give them some advice about what to pay attention to heading into 2025. What are some data points or some key things to say, pay attention to when Trump puts in the tariffs, et
Mhm.
cetera, et cetera? What are some
Yeah.
things that you would point to that would point to the projection of where Saskatchewan's economy will head in the short and medium term?
So, the tariff thing is going to determine a lot of what happens. But if you want to look at sort of the overall health and go, we're going up or we're going down, unemployment's a good one to keep an eye on. And not just the headline rate, but some of the other more complex rates like underemployment or discouraged workers. Thankfully, Saskatchewan doesn't have much of a history of either. So, but if those start to creep up, so by underemployment, people working jobs they're overqualified for, or people who are working part time who really, really want to work full time. Either of those things start to rise, that's not a good indicator. Um, Discouraged workers, those are people who, I want to work, but there's no work for me here, so I quit looking, right? And so I just give up. I'm discouraged. And if that happens, that's a sign that things are really going sideways. Um, Things like retail spending is a good indicator as well. Look at your own wages. I mean, if your wages are rising nicely, things are probably going to be okay, right? If your wages aren't rising nicely, there's probably a lot of other people in the same boat. Um, all of those kind of things, and inflation. Keep an eye on inflation, like you mentioned earlier. If we get into a trade war, that's going to be inflationary, and that's going to erode your ability to consume. And we've seen one bout of this just recently. You look a little younger than maybe I think I am. This may have been your first real experience with inflation that wasn't right around 2%. And there are a lot of people in that boat that have never had to think about or deal with planning for higher order inflation. And that would be something I don't think we're necessarily at the end of the inflationary problem yet.
Yeah, the dangers of inflation is as you start to prepare for it, it starts to become kind of a reoccurring cycle that if something costs me, today this price, and I know in 6 months it's going to be more expensive, well, I'll start to pre-stock, and then this, there's a lot of different things that the inflation is a dangerous um, animal to play with. So fingers crossed it doesn't get worse than we've seen. But you are right. I am young, and my wife is actually from Serbia, and her parents tell stories of hyperinflation in old Yugoslavia, and paying off a mortgage with what would have cost a pack of cigarettes. Take old debt, and then inflation basically eroded the value of the money. And something that we would hope to avoid at all costs.
Things tend to go really poorly when there's hyperinflation. I mean, for example, I'm a 100 trillionaire.
Right.
I am. I've got $100 trillion. It's one bill. It's from Zimbabwe. It's not worth anything, but it's one of those horrifying examples of what can go wrong when you get a government that's irresponsible.
Yes, my brother for my birthday a couple of weeks ago bought me a $5 billion Zimbabwe note because we love to discuss these things, and it is funny that we attribute names like millionaire and billionaire, And really, it's just a name, because if inflation erodes all the value, it really only matters what you can buy with that money.
Right. Money, one that everybody forgets, even Canadian money isn't backed by anything. It's a fiat currency. It has there's nothing behind it other than the government saying, yeah, it's money. And people don't realize that or forget it. And so that value can erode very, very quickly if we aren't careful.
Brilliant. A couple last questions for you, Dr. Childs. One, if you could go back and talk to a younger version of yourself, what advice would you give?
Seriously get into investing as soon as you can and start saving as soon as you can and get compound interest on your side as early as you can. Um, a lot of people would have said, and I'm sensitive to who's hosting, get on the property ladder, and that's served me reasonably well. I'm not sure I'd give the same advice to young people right now. Uh, I'm not. Saskatchewan isn't as bad as some other places. If we were in Toronto, I would not be advising anybody to rush into the property ladder. Here, I think the game's a little different. But think about what other advice I give. Study a little harder, get better at math.
I know you probably don't have the need for hundreds of people to reach out to you in questions. So I'll phrase this in two different ways. How could people get in touch with you? Or two, what resources do you pay attention to? Podcasts, books, different figures that you kind of really like to enjoy their content.
So there is one. There's a Saskatchewan Economy dashboard. It updates regularly with StatScan data and gives you a reasonably good snapshot of what's going on over a number of dimensions. So I'm a data junkie. Another one I'll read quite frequently is the Daily from StatScan. They give updates. They walk you through a lot of what's going on. It's a government output, so it's going to have a slant to the commentary that favors the government of the day, and it does. I've been reading this thing for a long time, and when it was one party in government, it was slanted a certain way, and now it's a different party in government, it's slanted a different way, and that's fine. Just understand that there's going to be a pro-government bias, whatever the government is. Those are two really great resources. Really quick, there's a growing host of media. I'm not a big podcast consumer for work. I'm more reading the raw data and academic papers, so I'm probably the wrong one to be playing tour guide for that.
Brilliant. Well, Dr. Childs, thank you so much for coming on today and giving us some of those insights on what we could potentially see and the things to watch for. I am not a data guy, but I really like the overall story part. So for me to be able to interview you and get some of those hard facts is always a real treat. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that knowledge. And if possible, would love to get you on in the future to help expand upon more topics for us.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back and see how wrong I was.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Childs.
Cheers.
Thanks for checking out this episode of the Saskatchewan Real Estate Podcast. Before you go, a quick reminder that I'm a fully licensed mortgage broker in Saskatchewan. If you're a first-time homebuyer, have a renewal or refinance coming up, or need assistance with advanced mortgage strategies, I am here to help. If you're looking for assistance, simply head to ronqmortgage.ca or click on the description of this podcast episode for my booking calendar. I would love to help you on your next mortgage transaction. Until next week, I'm Ron Caroni, your Saskatchewan mortgage professional. Bye for now.